Wake this morning to yet another foreign trip for Sir Keir Starmer. Shoots off to Brazil. For a man who said that he wants to spend a lot of time with his family and he didn't really want to have his job impinge on that, particularly on a Friday night, he doesn't spend a lot of time at home, does he?
He loves going overseas, doesn't he? He really does. And, you know, let's not forget, this is a man who was once asked if he preferred Davos to Westminster, and he said Davos.
Yes.
You know, he prefers mingling with a kind of global elite rather than mucking about with us lowly Brits here at home. So I do think there's definitely an element where he loves this kind of high-flying power he has to mingle with important, powerful people and to get away from us lot, essentially.
Yeah.
I think that's what this is about. But there's also the hypocrisy of it. As you said earlier, you know, this is a man who goes on and on about climate change all the time, and so does Ed Miliband and all the rest of them, and yet he's jetting around the world more than the rest of us do in a lifetime, and he's done that in a space of 3 months. It's very hypocritical.
It's indeed so. I mean, according to one of the stories this morning in the papers, he's been in Ireland, he's been in Italy, Berlin, Brussels, Budapest, Washington, France, Azerbaijan, 5-day trip to Samoa, went to New York as well for the UN General Assembly. I mean, you know, the list goes on and on and on. I was saying earlier, it's a bit like when I was a kid, you used to go to all these different countries and buy a patch that you could sew onto your bomber jacket. And so you know, the more you had, the bigger a deal it was. I mean, you know, he's a grown man. I don't understand. He won't be here, of course, for the big demonstration from farmers tomorrow.
Well, that's not surprising at all, because it seems that the Labour government doesn't care about farmers, not one bit. And, you know, I think the way they've treated farmers is really shocking. This whole inheritance tax hike on farmers is just awful. It's going to destroy some farming families. You know, the way that the elites treat farmers is a scandal. It's a scandal of our time. And it's not just in Britain, it's happening across Europe, where there are all sorts of net zero policies that are pummeling farmers. And we've seen farmers protest in the Netherlands, in France, in Germany, huge uprisings of farmers. And now we're seeing the same in Britain over the inheritance tax. I think what it really speaks to is we have an establishment that is so out of touch, which is so disconnected from everyday life and everyday people, that it can't even respect the people who make our food. It can't even show respect for the people who keep society going by feeding us the stuff that keeps us alive. So that disconnection and that lack of concern for this incredibly important industry, I think it really speaks to an elite that has lost the plot.
Well, it does really, doesn't it? Because the more you see this kind of, you know, neo-Marxist group of people in the cabinet who seem to be driven more and more by ideology and less by common sense, you know, they're not interested in anybody making an argument against what they're doing. You know, they're taking the pensioners' winter fuel allowance away because it's the right thing to do. And that's the end of the conversation. You know, they're now going after farmers because it's the right thing to do. It's not fair, apparently, that people pay inheritance tax if they hand over a business to their families, and farmers get away with it. So they must be punished. You know, it's got this rather stench of animal farm about it, hasn't it?
It's just that real kind of moral zeal they have to push forward these policies with no regard for a difference of opinion or some analysis as to the impact these policies will have. So, for example, one of the arguments made about the winter fuel cutback is that this will lead to, of course, greater coldness for some older people, which will lead to more hospitalizations, which will lead to a greater bill for the state at the end of the day. So there's not even that basic analysis, never mind the moral concerns about taking money away from older people who've worked their whole lives, and also punishing farmers, financially punishing farmers, even though they do one of the most important jobs in this country. Just that lack of regard for ordinary people and the struggles they face, it really demonstrates that Labour has become completely separated from the people it was founded to represent, which is the working class. It now looks upon the working class with utter contempt and disdain. It sees us as a bunch of gammons who are probably racist and Europhobic and xenophobic. It just looks down its nose at us, and that's demonstrated in its policies.
Yes, I mean, it's become a sort of green, fanatical, you know, sort of two-tier system where they think nothing of taking freebies, they think nothing of lying on their CVs. I mean, the Rachel Reeves situation, to me, is a real good indicator of what's wrong with modern politics. You know, you've got a woman who not only pretended to write a book that she seems to have plagiarised, who pretended, to all intents and purposes, she was an economist, not just at the Bank of England, but also HBOS, which wasn't true. You know, she's now telling everyone she's an economic expert. She's nothing of the kind. She's no more of an economic expert than I am.
Well, she might well be less of an economic expert than you are.
That's probably true. I studied economics at university.
Well, there you go. You know, it really speaks to how amateurish this elite is. You know, they present themselves as the adults in the room. You know, this is the return of the grown-ups to politics after Boris and Brexit and all this stuff that they don't like. They said the same about Kamala Harris. The adults will be back in the room. And, of course, the Americans said, no, thanks, we don't want you. Thank
God. I was saying just earlier in the show, I mean, I occasionally have these kind of shivers that go down my spine as I watch Trump and the popularity that he's got. And I wonder what it would have been like if she'd won.
It would have been a nightmare, and it would not have been the adult in the room. You know, they present themselves as these very fair, expert-driven, technocratic people. But in fact, firstly, they're very ideological. They have some very eccentric, strange ideological beliefs. As we all know, they don't even know what a woman is. They're so twisted by this kind of modern ideology. But also, they're actually amateurs. You know, these are not the great big hitters that British politics might have been full of 40 or 50 years ago, when politics tended to be run by people who were really clever and knew their stuff, whether we agreed with them or not. We now have a new breed of politician who's actually very shallow, who has to make things up about their experience because it's actually not that substantial. I love the fact that when Rachel Reeves was exposed, some of her claims were exposed. She changed her bio on one of her social media pages from economist to retail banking. Because that's essentially what she did in some of these.
And there it is there. And I mean, that's on LinkedIn. And also even retail banker is a bit of a stretch. It sounds as though she was, you know, answering the phones to people who had complaints about what was going on.
Yeah, and it really does raise questions about the expert classes. That's how they like to present themselves. They're the experts, and us plebs are a bunch of low-information idiots who need to be told what to do all the time. That has been the view of politics for a long time, certainly since Brexit. And when Michael Gove said we're all sick of experts, which, by the way, we are, they all went nuts, saying, no, we're the experts, we'll tell you what to do. But this Labour government is not the return of adults to politics. It's not the return of grown-ups. The last few months of this government has been, I think, the worst start to a government in my lifetime. They are incompetent. They're out of touch. They are pursuing policies they said they wouldn't pursue. They're jetting around the world. They're making stuff up on their CVs. This is a bunch of charlatans, essentially. And I think a lot of people who voted for them, I'm not one of them, will now be asking questions about whether they were right to do so.
Absolutely right. I mean, he looks so out of place. He looks out of touch. He doesn't seem to be in any way on top of his brief. He doesn't even seem to know. I mean, we've got... Let me play you this, actually, because it's so ridiculous. This is Labour's latest ad, which was put out over the weekend, and Keir Starmer's voice gets more and more robotic as it goes on. But check this out and tell me you can find anything in it that is anything close to reality.
The budget will light the way, and we will use the power of government, stability, investment and reform, partnership across the whole of society, galvanised by clear objectives to deliver on the priorities of the British people. Foundations fixed, public services renewed, a country rebuilt by investment, released from decline, returned once more to the service of working people.
He keeps talking about the service of British people. I mean, there's none of that makes any sense at all. None of it is real. None of it is true. He's done none of it.
He's done none of it. It doesn't mean anything. It's all these platitudes that he absolutely has no intention of following up on anyway. And then there's the voice. I mean, I know we shouldn't focus too much on the voice. He can't really help it.
It's hard to avoid it, though.
It's hard to avoid it, and I do think it's getting worse. It's this kind of soul-destroying voice that he has, which just doesn't engage people. I mean, it is important to have... I'm sure people find my voice annoying. I'm sure some people probably find your voice annoying, Mike. You know,
I hope so.
We all have our different tastes in voices, but if you're a politician, if you're the Prime Minister, you need to be able to draw people in. You need to be able to excite people or at least interest people. But Tony Blair could do it, whatever one thought of his policy.
Totally.
Even David Cameron can do it. Boris could certainly do it.
Yeah.
But I think his demeanor, his manner, his robotic, stiff approach is actually indicative of the broader political class now. They're so dislocated from everyday life that they don't even make much of an effort to engage us. So I think that ad really summed up this Labour government.
It sort of does, doesn't it? Because it's almost as though he's governing despite the people. But for him to keep saying it's a partnership with the people, as if you say it often enough, it becomes true. That seems to be their guiding kind of, philosophy. That if you just keep telling everyone that we're working with you and we're doing this for you and it's a government of service, when it plainly isn't, that people will be so stupid that they'll just fall for it.
Yeah, it's that. Well, that's another part of his voice, isn't it? It's designed to be slightly hypnotic. It's kind of like to bore us into submission, I suppose, and make us believe everything he's saying, even though it's patently not true.
Yeah.
It is not. This government is not a partnership with the people. In fact, it's the precise opposite. It's one of the first governments I can remember which, as you say, is governing against the people and constantly says, things are going to get really hard. We're going to punish you in this way and that way, and we're going to take away this and take away that. But it's for your good. It's for your own good. And then, of course, there's the nanny state where they're bringing in all these new rules about smoking and drinking, and no doubt junk food will be next for our own good. They see us as this big blob of problematic human beings that need to be managed and controlled. That is essentially how they are approaching the electorate, not as citizens to be engaged with, but as problematic creatures to be, effectively controlled and told.
To be herded, if you like. I've got this from David, who sent it in a little bit earlier, and it's a quote, actually. I don't like to get too ethereal here on the morning show, but Alexander Solzhenitsyn says, a communist system can be recognised by the fact that it spares the criminals and criminalises the political opponent. They're doing a fair bit of that as well.
They are doing a fair bit of that. And the two-tier justice system, I mean, that's another problem that has really come to light under this government. And we all know it's true. We've all seen it with our own eyes. We all know that, if you wrote something horrible on Facebook after the riots or during the recent riots, you would be put in the slammer for months on end. And if you wrote something else, or if you go on a one of those pro-Palestine demos and say death to Israel, death to Zionists, pretty much nothing happens to you. So this is a government that is ruling in a quite arbitrary and tyrannical way, actually, and it is going to. I think it's going to become even more authoritarian as the months go on.
Absolutely, nothing to look forward to here. Brendon O'Neill, great to talk to you. Thanks very much indeed, Chief Political Writer at Spike there.